right. Welcome back to the Onyx Report. Hope all is well. Yeah, trying to get one in. I saw a video I want to respond to. There's actually a few that I'll be doing some responses to, but this one is only about 10 minutes long. So I'm going to show it and I'll stop at points and discuss it. This is coming from Marc Lamont Hill, somebody who he's a feminist. He's an intersectional feminist. So on that basis alone, I have disagreements. I tend to agree with his takes on Israel and Palestine, though. I think he's well informed there. But as far as his takes on gender, it's usually predictably Black feminists. So, and that basically means you defer to whatever Black women have said or are saying. There's no pushback. There's no real analysis there other than to just kind of mimic. But anyway, and you'll notice because this conversation he's having here is pretty old. It's pretty repetitive. And it's about Black men who voted for Trump. And again, I'm not even, I'm not a Trump voter. I didn't vote for Trump either time. I'm not a conservative. I'm not a Republican. I'm an independent. I tend to vote third party. So, my statements here aren't even about defending Trump. It's really more about defending the objectification of Black men. And I think it's gotten comfortable, especially amongst the left, to do that with Black men, to objectify Black men, to turn them into a caricature, to be mocked and dismissed despite whatever the data may say. And I think that's been popular. And as I've said in my review of Captain America, Brave New World, one of the things that we ignore is that it's not just, that the right wing is racist and the left wing is, this just party trying to liberate the poor. As it pertains to Black men, we find ourselves alienated by both groups. In other words, the right sees Black men, especially now, as just another group that benefits from DEI. And the left see Black men, heterosexual Black men, as a problem simply because they're heterosexual males. And heterosexual masculinity is considered inherently toxic unless it's been redeemed by some type of feminism. And as long as it's done that way, and of course, that's one of the main reasons that LGBT masculinities, I say that in quotes, are received well, because it's implicitly understood that they've been enmeshed in feminism one way or another. I mean, the entire idea of LGBT defers to femininity. So it is acceptable there to explore masculinity. But if you're heterosexual and male, the only way to do so is to do so through the veil of feminism, which means that you've been kind of baptized in some type of acceptable form of gender practice, right? But if you're critical of feminism and you advocate for masculinity, whether you support the left, the right, whether you vote for one party or another, it really doesn't matter. The left is going to see you as inherently toxic. The right is going to see you as a DEI hire, even though Black men really haven't benefited from DEI in any discernible way. So we find ourselves on the outs from either party. And contrary to popular opinion, which we're going to explore in this video clip, the idea is that, Black men just want to mirror and repeat what white men are doing. That's the popular go-to kind of Black feminist analysis of Black male behavior that doesn't defer to Black feminism. We just want to repeat what white men are doing, regardless of what actual Black men are actually saying. Now, I'll give Hill credit here where he at least says he's talked to Black men, but I say that with a grain of salt, right? Because there's a lot of different types of approaches to this whole issue. Nevertheless, the idea, though, that Black men are just trying to parrot white men and really aren't exploring alternative voting patterns, alternative political strategies, simply because the ones we've been using haven't benefited us, most particularly not just the Black community as a whole, but Black men in particular. We've not been a priority of either party, right? And just to remind people that Black males were the second highest voting group, and this is not a new thing. This has been going on for quite a while. Behind Black women, Black males were the second highest voting group on the left as far as Democrats are concerned. And that includes this past election between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. And yet Black men have been identified as the potential threat to her potential presidency since the day she was announced. So that said, let's get into this piece. And we can kind of comment on what we see here. Here we go.
And this is my experience. I watch so many Negro men in particular tell me why they voted for Trump. Ooh. am stunned.
Look at that. Are black men the weakest link? Right? These are the kinds of statements that black men are comfortable making as long as feminists pat us on the head. Right? So we make these kind of self-deprecating, kinds of statements, regardless of the facts. But here we go.
Stunned at the number of black men who tell me they voted for Donald Trump. I am shocked at the number of people in barbershops everywhere. When I talk to them, they be like, yo, I voted for Trump, man. I couldn't. It's either.
Okay, so it's everywhere, except the overwhelming majority in the last two elections involving Trump, as far as black male votes are concerned, went to the Democratic candidate. And this is one of the reasons. Look, at the bottom line, I'm just going to say it out the gate. One of the problems I have with Marc Lamont Hill on this video is that he decided to do it in the first place. And second, that despite how black men voted as a whole, he still saw this as a worthy show to hold, to denigrate the black men who are in extremely small numbers. Whether that's good or bad is irrelevant. I'm not making a judgment call. I'm simply pointing it out. Black men are relatively small in voting power anyway, but the subset that voted for Trump are incredibly small. And yet you saw it important enough to do a show to denigrate black men when we know it's white women and Latinos that are the primary groups in question. We already know white men were going to vote Republican in the largest numbers, but white women and Latinos are the swing vote, if you could use that term in this instance, and not black men. But they find it a worthy topic, just like Roland Martin did. And, this is a comfortable trope on the left to denigrate black men, despite that we are the second group, the second highest voting demographic out of all of them, except for black women. And the reason that this is important is it kind of shows you that it doesn't really matter what black men do, whether it's the right or the left, we're going to be denigrated either way. So what we end up needing to do is develop our own political strategy, regardless of whichever group, whatever their perspective of us is. We're going to have to, determine for ourselves what is immediately useful, what is problematic, what is unproductive. We need to determine that outside of these major groups, because they're actually not paying attention to us. They're looking for reasons to reinforce the stereotypes and problematic approaches to black masculinity they already are invested in. And why are they invested in it? Because it's profitable. As a feminist, male or female, you can get up and say black men are monsters, black men are stupid, black men are the white men in the black community, black men are the weakest link, and you can get applause, you can make money, most particularly from women. And not just black women for that matter, but women in particular, right? This is popular and it's accepted.
I couldn't vote for Kamala, or I really rock with Trump. They whisper it, but the whispers, which are more prominent in 2016, excuse me, are now they kind of saying it like with their chest out. Like, I voted for Trump, I rock with Donald. I don't know what we're talking about.
You know what we're really talking about? As much as you want to make it about men and their faulty analysis on this, this is the problem. It's not the Republicans' fault. It's not black men's fault. It's the left's fault. What the left did is they vilified masculinity. They vilified it. Now, what Trump figured out was that you have a pocket of votes that nobody's catering to. Now, you could say he did it because he's a Republican, but the truth is this is more of a political move. In other words, I'm saying the reason that Trump really began to lean into men is because he's a politician. And a politician running for an election is going to look for pockets of votes that haven't really been invested in and cater to them. This is what politics is. And don't get it twisted, the left did the same thing. They've just been doubling down on the same tactic for the last number of elections. Their idea is to focus on women. What did Kamala Harris do? She came out and talked about abortion. She talked about topics that she thought would mobilize the women's vote. And they were waiting for this tidal wave of women to come in the voting booths and take over. That's what the push was. They saw women that voted on the right as traitors to their own gender. And this is why Michelle Obama got up and was telling women across race to lie to their husbands. And she's really talking about women on the right. Lie to their husbands and vote Democrat so that you could advocate for abortion and other topics relevant to women. This is the focus. But what the real problem is not necessarily what the Republicans did by picking up a discarded demographic, men across race. right? The problem is not that the Republicans picked that demographic up. The problem is that the Democrats discarded it in the first place. They villainized masculinity, alienated men who are not necessarily feminists, and then turned around and castigated Black men who sought alternative voting patterns because the primary party that we've been voting for decades alienated and ignored them. That's the problem. That's the frustration. And what you're seeing amongst the rank and file everyday brother is an appreciation in some fashion, even if it's politically motivated, because at the end of the day, all the topics that either candidate talked about was politically motivated. There's only one party that actually paid attention to men's issues, men's needs. And I'm saying this as the archivist behind the Black male political agenda, which is not targeted at any particular party. And if you don't know what the Black male political agenda is, you can put it in Google. You'll come up on it. You'll see my name, Dr. T. Hasan Johnson. You'll see the new Black Masculinities website, the blog, I should say, and it'll take you right to the agenda itself, which is at 18 points as it stands right now. 18 points that are proposals, political policy proposals written by and for Black males. Advocate for an improved quality of life. And we don't care which parties address them, as long as we can get them on the tally. And I do believe we've been making strides in influencing people. I myself have spoken to several politicians under the table on the right and the left who have picked pieces of the agenda to use in their campaigns, which is what the agenda is designed for. But at the end of the day, because we've kind of taken the Ice Cube approach. I don't particularly care who I work with as long as they follow through on using our ideas to improve the quality of life for Black boys and men. So that said, the problem here, the frustration they have with rank and file Black men who voted for Trump, although small in number, is that these men were mostly, I mean, there are different motivations, but I start with, they were mostly concerned with a party that actually paid them some degree of attention. That's first and foremost, versus the party that discarded them and told them they were toxic. That's the first thing. And if you're not going to own what the Democrats did, then this is a disingenuous conversation, first and foremost. That's the first part. Now, second, there are those who are in different tax brackets. I've met several Black men who are, multiple six-figure earners to millionaires, and they have their reasons for voting for Trump that are rooted in tax purposes, rooted in, they have their rationale. It's not, contrary to popular opinion, it's not just, Trump likes to hang out with rappers, so he's cool. I mean, this is the kind of analysis the left likes to give you about Black men. It's essentially a coded way of saying Black men are dumb. That's what they're doing. They're investing in this idea that Black men are dumb. And they're high-fiving each other at the lack of intelligence of Black men without acknowledging why. Now, why some Black men have decided to vote on the right. Now, keep in mind, the number did grow from the last election, the 2016 election, to now in terms of the percentage of Black men that voted for Trump. But what they're also going to ignore in this is the number grew for women too, Black women who voted for Trump. But again, both groups were such a small demographic. That's not what made the election. What made the election were white women and Latinos. But here we go.
Black women, and I don't believe that we should be loyal to the Democratic Party at all. But I think we should be loyal against Donald Trump. Black women were more loyal to, Black women were fairly unanimous in not voting for Donald Trump.
Now listen how he trips over his words. And the reason he's tripping over his words is he does not know how to critique Black women. This is what Black male feminists grapple with. Even if they have the testicles to have a critique, and most don't tend to have a critique in the first place, they don't know how to articulate it without it sounding timid, tripping on their words, almost apologizing in their very posture, because you're not supposed to disagree with Black women. And this is one of the reasons that a lot of men are withdrawing from these types of feminists, because at the end of the day, if you can't even speak full-throatedly about your critiques in regard to various members of your own party, your own demographic, especially when they're women, if you can't articulate a full-throated critique without apology, I mean, because what you'll notice is these various kinds of men have no problem critiquing Black men full-throatedly, looking directly at the camera, but they're quick to dismiss and make light of and objectify black men simply on the basis of disagreeing about a political outlook, but again, not holding their own party accountable for discarding those men in the first place.
Trump. White women sold us the F out. Yeah, I didn't expect nothing from white women, from white men. So I guess my question is, with so much at stake around Black reproductive justice, around DEI, around the Supreme Court, around education, around housing, all these things, for Black men to vote, and again, Black men didn't vote like 90% for Trump or anything like that. Black men are the second most loyal group to Democrats other than Black women. So I don't want to be hyperbolic here. But
see, and I appreciate that he's willing to admit that it was white women that changed the vote and traded on them, or traded against them, and that it's not a significant population of Black men. He's willing to admit that, and I appreciate that because most don't. However, you're still holding the show with a title at the bottom that says, "Are Black men the weakest link?" If the population of Black men, if the demographic that voted, the percentage of the demographic that voted for Trump is so small, and it is, why are you holding a whole show to denigrate Black men? Why is your show not about Black men who voted the way you wanted them to vote in the largest numbers? In other words, if you're going to talk about Black male voting patterns, why aren't you talking about what the overwhelming majority of Black men who voted for? Why are you not celebrating that Black men and women on the left share a predominant number of votes in the same direction, the direction you advocate for? Well, I shouldn't say that. He just admitted a second ago he doesn't advocate for the Democratic Party, but you notice he's not critiquing Black women who are the first or the highest in terms of advocating for the Democratic Party. He doesn't critique them. He critiques Black men. He acknowledges that white women did it. He kind of dances around it, but keeps his focus on Black men. But is there any solid critique against Black women for voting in majority numbers? Like, if you're going to be a third party activist and you're going to talk about how you're not beholden to either political party, then you got to hold that critique all the way through. You got to critique Black women who are the number one voters for Democrats in the Black community, but he doesn't want to do that. So it's easy, it's low-hanging fruit to just kick Black men, to make your show about Black men, even though you admit to knowing they are not the catalyst behind this. This is what I consider disingenuous about this particular approach. And this is something that I've seen Roland Martin do and others on the left, other Black males on the left, Black male feminists. This disregard of Black men, because it gets you points with Black women. That's the foundation of it. And we've been trained to look to be patted on the head by Black women.
There's a way that I'm hearing Black men talk about the support of Trump that shocks me. And I hear some people saying, well, Black men are the weakest link here. They're the problem. When you hear that language of Black men being the weakest link, what do you say?
And she smiles, because now it's a matter of saying it without saying it.
Okay. So, I mean, the language is always going to be troubling for me. I want to point that out. What I think is we have a lot of people, inclusive in that, some Black men, prefacing this. And I think it's important to say that there are a lot of people who are not men, who are seduced by the allure of getting to do what white men do with impunity.
Now, this is we've seen this approach going back to the Man Not. If you read Tommy Curry's Man Not, one of the things he talks about is this is an argument that's gone back to the early 19th century push to vote. And the idea was that if Black men get in a position to vote and Black women or women in general can't vote, all Black men are going to do is mirror white men because they just want to be white men. And this is an old critique that's often been pushed by Black feminists. And it's still, you can see it's still handy to pull out and use, right? He offers no evidence, but the idea is that the only reason somebody could have for voting for Trump is that they're trying to mimic white men. And I think that in and of itself is immediately dismissive of a lot of Black men who, even if they have motivations I don't agree with, have nothing to do with their quality of character, have nothing to do with their intelligence. In other words, they can be intelligent and choose to vote for someone you don't like for reasons you may not agree with. But that doesn't make them unintelligent. It doesn't make them, all these kinds of things. These kind of tropes that we're seeing used are ways of really dismissing Black male humanity. And that's my fundamental problem. That's my motivation for even addressing this video. It's a way of dismissing Black male humanity. because Black men decided to use alternative methods to try and achieve, goals of political stability. And when you're going to break from the primary method the majority of the community uses, of course, you're going to be denigrated. I mean, I myself, as a third party voter, I lost friends. I had a best friend of over 30 years who stopped speaking to me because I wouldn't vote for Kamala. And the primary issue there is not who I voted for, it's that I didn't vote for Kamala. That's the fundamental problem. You know what I mean? So it's not just that if you voted for Trump, you get castigated as a Black man. It's if you don't vote for the Democratic, and they try to make it about Kamala, but we hear this every 4 years. This is not new. Every 4 years, the same logic, the same arguments are used to denigrate Black men who trying to find alternatives, and sometimes explore alternatives that the community has been dead set against. But when you have a party like the Democratic Party who has ignored your political interests beyond surface, beyond performance, beyond symbolism, but nothing substantive, then you're going to have people that are going to be willing to try whatever to see what falls out of the tree. Because at the end of the day, you keep giving your votes to the Democrats, and what happens? What's achieved? What is specifically targeted at Black folk that benefits us from giving our votes unilaterally to the same party every 4 years? Black men are some of the first to question this, to the extent that they're willing to put their vote behind their willingness to find an alternative solution. Now, there are plenty that also absconded and didn't participate at all. But here we go.
And that level of aggrandizing and feeling fit to this idea that I want this thing, right? We know it's not a liberatory politic. We've seen this time and time again with a number of groups. That the impunity that white men have. It's why we are like, well, what about this person when there's some kind of sexual violence allegation against someone who's Black or someone who's brown or someone who's a non-white person? And I think that says a lot about where we are in terms of being able to galvanize in this moment about the fact that we are so fractured and we are so deeply tethered to this idea that white men's power is what is seductive.
We're not deeply tethered to this idea. If anything, the voting patterns suggest that what we're more deeply tethered to is voting for the Democratic Party. Because again, when we look at the numbers in regard to, those Black folk who voted, male and female, they overwhelmingly voted for the Democratic Party. So if you're going to talk about over what we're deeply tethered to, then again, stick with the data. The data tells us that we are actually deeply tethered to what you advocate for. So if you're going to talk about Black men and you're going to pick out those who didn't vote the way you wanted them to, at least be honest about the critique. Don't start on this. This attempt to dismiss Black men as wanting to parrot white men, even though the majority of Black men who voted the way you think they should, is reeking with a disingenuous approach.
And that's what we want, that we have track of what liberation could and should look like. And I think that we can talk about the ways that an investment in patriarchy plays out in this, how misogyny plays out in this, how the unique position of Black men in this country and their relationship to power or lack thereof can make patriarchy even more seductive, can make misogyny.
This is about patriarchy and misogyny. I was waiting for those catch whistles, those dog whistles, those catch terms that everybody's familiar with, right? Patriarchy and misogyny. That's the only motivation for voting for Trump. That's the only motivation for voting against the Republicans and voting Democrat, is that you're either advocating for patriarchy or you're denouncing it, right? This is how feminists have dumbed down the conversation to the point where they've classified people in two major camps, and that's it. That's as far as we go, right? That's as far as it goes. And I myself, have met a number of Republicans that have all kinds of reasons for what they do. It has nothing to do with whether I agree or don't agree. Simply that their humanity is such that they have a variety of reasons for what they advocate for. If you don't believe me, go over there and listen to Dennis Sperling's channel. This is a brother who grew up in the Black community, who voted Democrat, switched to Republican a number of years ago. He can articulate to you why. But you don't ask him, an attorney, what his reasons are. You talk about this amorphous idea of people at the barbershop who vote for Trump just because they're stupid. This dehumanization is problematic.
Even more seductive for some. But I think what we really have to get at is that a lot of folks are invested in that kind of ethic as a one that's about liberation. Because if you can't imagine a world in which
See this, and also I should say on these kind of feminist shows, whenever there's a woman present, she can take front stage, center stage. She can say what she wants. She will get no pushback, none. She will get no pushback. She can say whatever she wants, and black men nod in approval because that's what we're trained to do. We're not trained to push back. If you push back, there's already questions about you, about your blackness, about all of that. But she can say whatever she wants, even if she contributes to the denigration and the mischaracterization of black men, even the dehumanization of the black male idea in media. None of it matters. None of it is a problem. She can go full carte blanche, say whatever she wants, and it's applauded. And we applaud like seals because that's what we were trained to do.
getting to do what fucked up white men do with impunity is.
Okay. So what did black men do? Black men who voted for Trump, what fucked up thing did they do with impunity? Tell me that. What did they do? I'll wait.
The standard by which you know you're free, then we're not really talking about freedom.
That's a powerful point. Slap.
Yeah, that's a powerful point, right? See what I said? No pushback.
You be outside. Reasonably so, in all the respectable and acceptable ways that one can be outside at our age. You're in the community is what I mean. You engage folk. When you hear what Treva just said, when you hear what I just said, how do you make sense of it? I mean, you know, I know you know black men. We even talked about this before, but I know you know black men that voted for Trump or supported Trump, or at least didn't vote in a way that would lead to him not being president. How do you process that, especially in light of what Treva just said around people, some of our investments in patriarchy, some of our investments in kind of not Trump per se, but what Trump represents, etc. What do you say?
So to be fair, and not to be hyperbolic in any way, right, is that one, I live in a black ass city. Let me just state that.
You're Baltimore.
Yes. I also am a member of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. I am a proud Mason of Prince Hall. And I'm going to tell you flat out, I don't know no black men that voted for Trump, or at least it was said to me. I think that the people that I do know, understood the assignment, as they would say, right? And they knew that we were entering into dangerous times, even if you had.
So you got somebody here who's saying that he doesn't even know black men who voted for Trump, which in some ways speaks to how small the number is. But that could have been a more realistic approach for a show, right? Where you actually bring in black Trump voters and talk to them rather than objectify and denigrate them from a distance. How about that? If the number of them is so small that you don't even know any of them, and other than the guys at the barber shop who said they voted for Trump, then why would you not just interview them, have a conversation with them? Because at the end of the day, these are still black men. But no, we can't have that. We have to find ways to denigrate them and denounce their humanity because somehow they did the most atrocious thing possible. And the only reason they did it, i.e. voting for Trump, is because they want to, as the lady at the bottom said, do fucked up shit, like white men do.
One aspect of, and I think this was the problem was with a lot of males that you're speaking of. And by the way, I want to state for the record that when this thing came across the screen, I immediately got offended. And I was just like, Jesus. But I want to state that there wasn't anybody that I knew that voted that way, or at least would open-handedly admit it, because a lot of people understood that even the one thing or the one way that they agreed with Trump's policies, or that he's a businessman and that he might be better for their bottom line or whatever, they knew that he was destructive in several other ways. Whether it is that, you know what, this candidate isn't good for my wife, he's not good for my daughter, he's not good for my mother, right? And the one thing that I do know is that the men that I know, and I'm using that term, you know what I'm saying, not loosely, that the men that
I noticed that their motivations for not voting for Trump were strictly about how the idea of Trump, because he didn't mention what particular policies he was talking about. The idea of Trump is antithetical to the well-being of the women in his life, right? And he's projecting this on the men that he's saying he's talked to who didn't vote for Trump. But here's the issue. Here's one of the major issues I have and have had since the inception of my channel. Black men have never been taught to think about our own political position, right, outside of black women's interests. Now, years ago, I would say that's unimportant. We're black people. We got to do what we got to do as a community. But then the problem that arose in the 70s, and most particularly the 80s, is black women began to think about their political interests outside of black men. We never did. Now, I've challenged people before, and nobody's met the challenge yet. But when you go to the black male political agenda, I've challenged people to talk to black women about the first agenda point. You can talk to them about any of them, but I'm just start at the first one and see how far you get. And why do I say that? Because we're not supposed to think outside the political box that benefits the community, and most particularly black women. Only black women can do that. They can advocate for policies that don't necessarily have to be antithetical to black men or our well-being, but they can ignore us entirely. And if black men decide to focus on politics relevant to them, even though it does not put black women center stage, black girls, black women center stage, then it's a problem. So he's talking about the motivation of black men who voted for Kamala and how they put the women forth, front and center in their political outlook. How many black women put black men front and center in their political outlook, or black boys for that matter? If you have a predominant number of single parent led households where mothers are making sole decisions, especially in regard to raising their children, then it is a relevant question, politically speaking. Is there a contingent of women who put black boys and men at front and center in their political interests? They advocate for policies and speak full-throatedly to how those policies will benefit their boys or their men. Do we hear that? But we take on the responsibility of doing so, and I argue to the extent that we do ourselves damage by not even asking the question about what may benefit us politically. And going back to the black male political agenda, I can promise you that black men do have political interests that diverge from what we've been told are best for the black community as a whole, and definitely diverge from black women's political interests. It's just that only one gender demographic is allowed to advocate for themselves. Well, I shouldn't say one, because LGBTs can do that as well. They can advocate for policies that don't necessarily prioritize anybody but themselves. Women can do the same. It's only black men that can't. And we chastise ourselves, which is what this show is. I'm not mistaken. You got 3 heterosexual black men. Maybe I'm wrong. Could be wrong. I haven't followed these guys' lives, but I've seen a couple of them. I've seen, of course, Marc Lamont Hill. Chris Emden, I know less about, but I've seen him before, and his passion for education, I applaud. The other 2, I don't know, but I'm simply saying that from all appearances, you have 3 heterosexual black men, right? But you don't hear anything about the political interests of black men, heterosexual black men, that may diverge from the community or from other demographics in the community, and have their own rationale, not necessarily rationale that's rooted in voting for Republicans, but a rationale that diverges from what's popularly discussed in the black community. But notice in this platform, in this discussion, like with these 4 professors on this platform, nobody engages the question of whether or not black men have their own political interests. We accept that black women do. We accept that black LGBTs do. But black men doing so is unthinkable. We have to prioritize women and girls, and that's it. We don't ask for such prioritization from women and girls, however. We don't ask for any reciprocal behavior. It's a one-way dynamic, and that's the only acceptable way that happens.
That I know really do protect black women. The men that I don't know do stand with black women. They believe in black love. They believe in
see all the heads nodding, right? No pushback. You just accept.
The continuity of the black family. And so they knew that this guy was against that. And
we make the continuity of the black family synonymous with black women's political interests. But somehow black men's political interests can't be, coinciding with the longevity of the family. It has to be anti-family. It has to be anti-black. It has to be, something completely, and we label it black men who voted for Trump. But really, this is about black men who didn't vote for Kamala and who decided to explore other options, right? But again, even those who voted for Trump, to suggest that they're anti-black and don't have any motivation for doing so outside of whatever pejorative narrative you decided to give them to denigrate them in this show is problematic. Sit down and talk to some of them, and not the guy at the barber shop that we can't verify, or, you just, the way you characterize them. Actually talk. And not just to anybody. I mean, you could talk to brothers across class. Yes, get the unlettered brother who works as a truck driver. Get the lawyer, like I mentioned, Dennis Sperling. You can work across class and actually sit them down and have a conversation. It doesn't even necessarily have to be a debate. It could simply be a conversation. Because if you're saying you're not sure why these men would do that, why don't you ask them? And if anybody has enough pull to set up a panel like that, Marc Lamont Hill definitely does.
They just didn't bother. And then let me just go ahead and say that I'm fortunate enough to have a really, really good bullshit meter. And if, you know what I mean, I see that you ain't on the shit I'm on, then you got to get on. You know what I'm saying? Like, look, I ain't gonna shoot you like Harriet Tubman, but you can get the fuck away from me. You know what I'm saying? And that's just as real as I can be. So, you know, an attack on women's rights was an attack on my rights. An attack on gay rights is an attack on my rights. Attack on
women's rights, gay rights is an attack on my rights. How many do you hear in the camps that he just talked about saying the same thing about heterosexual black men? Who, by the way, contrary to what feminists and black feminists in particular have been arguing for years, are not privileged. They're not. They're not privileged. This idea that heterosexual men are inherently privileged is an idea that was taken straight from the white community. It was white women's feminist analysis of white men that was parroted. You want to talk about parroting? It's not black men parroting white women. It's in some arguments in the feminist space that are being parroted from the white community. This idea that heterosexual men are in power, they're oppressive, they're exploitive, they're privileged. These are ideas that were taken from the white community that don't apply in Black America. Black men are not privileged. And thus, it is a relevant question to ask if any of the demographics the gentleman just mentioned, do they advocate for black men? You know, I just did a small conference yesterday in LA on homelessness, and I was invited to talk about black men and homelessness because the conversations go all over the place. And there's this inherent understanding that black men grapple with homelessness and incarceration and violence and homicide. I mean, we know, you know, it's treated like, we already know that. We know that. So, but once we know those things, we don't want to talk about how they apply to homelessness, even in circles that are comprised of people who do nothing but work on homelessness. The conversation becomes about everybody else or a generic, you know, homeless person or unhoused person. Nobody wants to say black men, even though their numbers are much more dramatic. If anything, the data shows that black women, when they're dealing with homelessness, tend to deal with what's called hidden homelessness. In other words, they sleep on friends' couches. You know, that's black women's homelessness. It's called hidden homelessness. Black men's homelessness, you sleep under a fucking bridge. That's black men's homelessness. But even in those circles, and I think this is repeated in so many different conversations and contexts, you're not allowed to say black men unless you're framing them as privileged. But the data, and I'm just using homelessness as an example, feminists would argue that black men are somehow privileged because their situation is so dire that everybody talks about it. This is the assumption made, but I argue they actually don't talk about it. Black men just they fade into the background with an implicit understanding that we all seem to have, that black men have it rough. But we don't actually talk about black men, let alone focus on services that need to be distinctly marked for black men. We don't talk about that. They just fade into the background while everybody talks about everybody else, right? Whatever hot demographic is in the news or in the discussion at the time. And black men fade into the background. So that's why I say it is important that if you want to actually have a holistic voting demographic, a block, a community, then you actually do have to give a damn about heterosexual black men and what they're experiencing.
You know, anything black culture is an attack on me. So I couldn't say, oh man, you're gonna save me $10,000 as a tax break. So I'm gonna vote for you because my pocket's gonna be a little bit better. Oh wow, you charge me on the back end for these hospital bills for abortions and, you know what I'm saying, your childbirth and all the things that my people may need. You know what I'm saying? So,
you know, that was an interesting point he just made. He at least acknowledged what some of the motivations may be, even though he disagreed with them. I think that was a more genuine approach to the argument than what I see Marc Lamont Hill do, other than, you know, just kind of characterize some, you know, nameless guy at a barbershop who voted for Trump and imply that he did so for no reason. At least this gentleman pointed out some of the rationale behind where some people, you know, put their, you know, how they make their political decisions on who to vote for. And if you're in a certain tax bracket, you know, it's at least understandable. Now, again, even those aren't the only answers that I've heard brothers give. And I think it best to, you know, if that's a question you actually have, go ask them. But even still, at least that is more of an explanation than nothing. And the caricature that was brought up earlier, And here you go at the note at the bottom, Past the Joint podcast says the Black manosphere was effective in leveraging misogyny and misogynoir via Christian family values. Right. Because that's the only motivation. Couldn't actually be because Black men actually have political ideas and interests that go outside of what feminists are interested in talking about. And it's the left, right? Most particularly, it's the liberal left, liberal white women at that, right? Who entertain Black feminist issues to the degree that they've characterized non-conforming Black men, particularly non-conforming Black men associated with the manosphere, with nothing but misogyny and misogynoir. That's the only motivation. We're trying to find ways to oppress Black women. Word, really? Can't be that they've actually listed out political policies that actually advocate for boys and men. And the reason they're doing so is that, much of this, the resources we've been hearing about, especially in terms of what Doge has been finding, right? None of it goes to Black boys and men. None of it. None of it. But that's the problem, right? They're focusing on misogyny and misogynoir, but the resources going to everybody but them, not addressing their issues. And when Black men actually start to find ways to articulate their concerns and figure out how they could advocate for themselves, the only way we could categorize it is in the framework of misogyny and misogynoir. As soon as you hear that shit, that lets you know who you're talking to. You're talking to feminists that only frame the discussion along their political interests. And because they had the power of white liberals via the Democratic Party to back them, those concerns became the preeminent mainstream concerns of the left. And the only way to categorize men in the manosphere or Black men who are non-conforming was through this lens of misogyny. Now, what that means in the shorthand is you have to nod along and be in support of whatever feminists say in order to be considered a good boy. And this show is demonstrating what that looks like.
I couldn't never relate to it, and people I know didn't relate to it. So that's why when you put "Are Black men the weakest link?" maybe something that you know, not the ones that I know, because you come in the barbershop with that shit around me, I might pay the barber a little extra to, your hairline. You know what I'm saying? So
I respect that. Chris, I want to wait. By the way, Treva Lindsay, I want to give you a shout out for not rolling your eyes when he said he was a Kappa. Treva, jump on in. Chris, jump on in.
Yo, the smartest thing I could say right now is 3 words. What Treva said.
Wow. Say less.
Because that's it.
So he puts the misogyny back on the screen, and Chris defers to what she said, because that's acceptable, right? To cancel my voice and let Black women speak for me is the appropriate way to be considered a good Black man, and in this context, a responsible Black voter. To basically let her vote for you, to accept her talking points and give no pushback, to ask no questions. This is the posture that has been posed to Black men for the last few decades, especially in the mainstream, right? In terms of being considered a good voting Black man, or just a good Black man in general. Can you defer to her political interests, her worldview, her outlook, her talking points? If you can defer 100% and let her literally speak to you to the point where you can get on a panel and say, I have nothing to say, I just defer to everything she said, this is considered what it means to be a good boy. And I mean no disrespect to Chris Emden. Like I said, I particularly appreciate his passion and education, but I'm just looking at this like, this is a problematic position to take. And it really, they're raising this issue about Trump. I'm not making it about Trump, but you can. That's their show. I think it's a waste in the sense that so few voted in that regard, that it's to categorize Black men negatively because of who they choose to vote for and not look at the reasons behind it, the conditions behind it, the history that's alienated Black men, I think is disingenuous. But beyond that, to deny Black men an independent voice, even if you don't disagree with it, and then to malign them through caricature and stereotype because they don't agree with you is even more problematic when you know the history of Black men stereotype and maligning, particularly in this country. We don't need more of it. You don't need to deny their humanity because you disagree with them. Just disagree with them. But acknowledge the data. And the data showed that the overwhelming majority of those who voted the way you wanted them to. But they weren't the reason that Kamala lost. And you already know that.
Yeah, no, that's real. We can leave it right there.
A little something. I mean, I think, and this is coming up in some of the comments, we have to add in like where Black religiosity happens in this conversation, where a lot of these spaces, people have mentioned the manosphere, and different spaces, there are different institutions that are built. And I want to be clear here that there are still large parts of our population that extremely are conservative in various ways, socially conservative.
That's not new. That's not new. If you're going to make conservatism evil and then paint with a broad brush any Black folk that are conservative, then you got to take that back. Even though if the further back you go, the parties actually change names, but Black conservatism isn't new and it's not necessarily evil. I mean, although this is not a discussion I would think to necessarily, quote a comedian, but Chris Rock once said it, and I think he said it well. He said, some things I'm conservative about, some things I'm liberal. And I think in many ways, even though he was joking, he captured much of Black America, but especially Black men. It's not that we're liberal or progressive in terms of how the Democratic Party defines those terms across the board, or we're conservative by how the Republican Party defines that term across the board. It's neither. Many of us are shifting in our political alliances and allegiances. It's not until you get Black feminists in alignment with white feminists and white liberals who control the Democratic Party that then it becomes anything deemed conservative is evil and thus problematic. But you do have a long history of Black folk not just being conservative, but being flexible based on the issue. Police, funding and treatment, or I should say mistreatment of people, you'll find Black folk very flexible on how that should be addressed. LGBT issues, a little more conservative. These are not new things in the Black community. Now they're being labeled evil in an ahistorical gesture to somehow make the Black community non-compliant until they get fully on board with what feminists think the Black community should be doing, which is a very distinct definition of progressive. It's distinct. It's self-serving in regard to how feminists use it. But you gotta deal with the reality of it. Black people who are non-conforming are not evil because they're non-conforming. They're not evil if they vote conservative on some issues, especially if they vote like many Black people do, where they're liberal on others. You got to address the complexity of that.
That are, there are people who I think go into these spaces, and we saw this in 2016 when it came to Hillary, and white women being like, go in with their white suits on and their pen, and vote quite differently. And I think that I saw it just by sheer number, because I'm sitting in my mind like, I also don't know Black men who voted for Trump, and yet the numbers tell me something else, right?
And a lot of them lied.
And a lot of them lied, but I think we have to be really honest about the role that misogyny and misogynoir specifically plays. I think we have to be really honest about the ways that particular sects of the Black church can play in this. I think we have to be very honest about the way that even particular kind of heteronormative, this kind of notion of Black family can also work against this.
Idea about heteronormativity being problematic. The majority of the world is heteronormative, if you want to even use that terminology, which is tainted in many ways with a problematic approach to denigrating everyday people, right? For not supporting some of these latest ideas on LGBT culture and where it should be. No, that's a problem. Those are your values, but not all of us are going to let you impose them and judge us on the basis of them. We're not. Those are your issues. They're not necessarily Black people's approaches in general. That's a complex conversation. But at the end of the day, this kind of push to suggest that Black folk are not progressive enough, again, the term progressive in this moment being used by how the Democrats at this point define that term, is all kinds of problematic. And it needs to be challenged. Now, her approach at castigating religiosity in this way, look, at the end of the day, what I tend to find when it comes to these questions about misogyny and whatnot is they completely sidestep the way misandry plays into all of this. And she's not raising that point because it doesn't serve her interest to do so. Misandry, and anti-Black misandry for that matter, is incredibly relevant to this conversation and may even speak to the motivations behind why so many Black men decided to try an alternative method, even those who stayed on the couch, I guess they're calling it, right? And didn't vote at all. Those who voted third party like I did. Those who voted down ballot. There are all kinds of methods being used because that nobody wants to talk about, because if you talk about it, you got to actually bring questions to the Democratic Party. And to do so threatens the wallets of many of these Black feminists on top of that. We can't have that. We just have to denigrate the community, most particularly Black men, for traditional takes that every community engages in. But we have to find ways to denigrate Black men and be appalled at the number of them that voted conservative. Even though, again, the majority, overwhelming majority, voted the way you wanted them to. You don't applaud that. You don't actually talk about the progressivism you advocate for being overwhelmingly accepted amongst Black men. You're going to fixate on the smallest population to find new ways to denigrate Black men and accuse them of misogyny and misogynoir. This is one of the ways that anti-Black misandry works, by denying that it exists at all, that Black men are not hated for being Black men, especially conservative Black men. I mean, excuse me, not conservative, heterosexual Black men.
I am certainly not lost on me that I talked to a number of brothers who were talking to me about Kamala being married to a white man as a reason they would not support her, that at least...
That's ridiculous. But you know what? Aside from the fact that I didn't hear too many brothers talking about that, other than, you know what, the only time I heard about it is when they were laughing. And the reason they were laughing about Kamala dating a white man is they were laughing at how many Black women were 100% behind Kamala, knowing full well that if Obama showed up the very first time running for president with a white woman on his arm, Black women would not have voted for him. And I've said this for years, they did not vote for Barack Obama. They voted for Michelle. Barack was a proxy for Michelle. And even at that first election, I remember hearing Black women talking about, she's going to keep him in line. She's going to get him told whenever he needs to be. She ain't going to play. I heard that language the night of the election from Black women. I heard the arguments they were having, before they, found out about Michelle. I heard Black women talking about, I bet you he married a light-skinned woman, or I bet you he's married to a white woman. And when Michelle showed up, they were like, oh, they didn't vote for Barack. If Barack was with an Arab woman, a Mexican woman, it doesn't matter. If he was with anyone other than a traditionally ADOS FBA woman, he would have been panned by Black women. But when the reverse happens and you get the first Black female candidate in years running for president, she wasn't the first one. And of course, there's still debates about her Blackness. I don't particularly engage in that, but I know a lot of people do. But I do think it's a relevant question to say, if you haven't had an ADOS FBA president yet, including Obama, and it would have been nice to have one on the second time around, but they get more racially obscure each time, right? Traditionally Black candidates like Jesse Jackson and all them cats are laughable when it comes to actually reaching the level of becoming president. The more obscure, the more racially obscure, now we can talk about them being president. Okay. But somehow, when she comes in, she saunters in the room with a white husband, it's not a problem. But if Obama sauntered in with a white woman, a white wife, you mean to tell me these liberal-minded Black women would have voted for him with no qualifications? Really? And to somehow make it a reason, I haven't heard any Black man voting for Trump because Kamala had a white husband. Now, I'm not saying that it doesn't happen, but there's no way you're going to convince me without data that there was a significant enough population of Black men who voted for Trump who only did so because Kamala had a white husband. That's ridiculous. You're projecting. This is an issue Black women would have had with Black men, like Obama. They overlooked it with Kamala because they were primarily concerned about their own political interest. And they knew, or at least believed, as many women did, that if they could just get a woman into the White House, even if she's Kamala, that they could advocate for their own political interests to a greater degree. That's what the push was. So they didn't care about what race her husband was. That was reserved for Black male candidates only. Because trust me when I tell you, from Al Sharpton to Jesse Jackson and any other Black man that's run for president, if he ever showed up with anyone who was not Black on his arm, as far as the Black community is concerned, and most particularly Black women, he's already no longer a candidate. So she's trying to blame Black men for this, but this is not a talking point Black men had. The closest thing Black men had to this kind of talking point was laughing at the double standard that Black women pose to Black men who are running for office. That if you don't have a Black wife, we're not going to stand behind you.
It's wild to me.
So those are conversations that I did have, and I knew that conservatism in our community, being in a community at once that saw that, you know, a banner up, right? The biggest threat to the Black family is abortion, or the most dangerous place for a Black child is in a Black woman's womb. Like, there were just so many things that come up that spoke into something that I think we.
It might be because Black women have had the most abortions since the 1970s, over 20 million. That might be one of the reasons that talking point came up. So if you're going to advocate for abortion, but you're not going to look at the historical impact of abortion on the Black community, then these talking points are going to become offensive to you. But in reality, if you're going to advocate for that, then you need to address it. We can talk about poverty, we can talk about environment, we can talk about all those issues, but at the end of the day, it's a relevant talking point, because y'all have no problem talking about Black male homicide, even though you won't talk about the participation of Black women in that homicide. We can go into depth about, you know, who slept with who, whose baby was whose, and how many women have instigated one man against another for their own purposes. There's plenty of those kinds of stories, but we don't get into that. We talk about Black male homicide, we just talk about the fact that it's happening. When we talk about abortion, then we immediately have to find a new way to frame it, where the only motivation for abortion, you know, is some kind of narrative that has to do with her being sexually violated, or, you know what I mean? Something like, we have to create a narrative that only paints the archetypal woman, Black woman getting abortion in one light. We can't complicate that, because that would seem like a denigration of Black women. And that's not allowed. The only people that can be denigrated are heterosexual Black men. Everybody else has to be held up on a pedestal and given a distinct narrative that frames them in some fashion as either victim or, what's the other one? Either framed as victim or innocent, right? It's Black men that can be denigrated with no pushback.
We have about what patriarchy does in our community, and what the institutions in our communities that reproduce that patriarchal system do, and then impact electoral outcomes in very real ways for Black communities, Black gender folks across the board.
Okay, so one of my main issues here, as you all probably know if you're a listener to my channel, is that this whole idea that patriarchy is somehow the problem is a feminist talking point. And notice how they don't have to frame how it's a problem. They don't even have to address whether or not it exists. If you ask a feminist to tell you when was the era and the time period where Black men ruled a patriarchy that oppressed Black women in America, what you'll often be given are anecdotal talking points about my grandmother and her husband beat her. You know, that's the response you get, because historically they can't point to one. They can't. So this is a dog whistle kind of idea that Black patriarchy is the problem. And the reason, and truthfully, the only reason it's the problem is because patriarchy is a problem for white women. You know, this is where I disagree with the video. I don't think it's white men mirroring white men that's the problem here. I think it's Black feminists, you know, mirroring white feminists. The suggestion that Black men are misogynoir, misogynists who are oppressing Black women, and Black patriarchy is cutting off Black women's access. It's laughable. It's ridiculous. Black men have never had the wealth, the standing, the capacity to produce policy that advocates for any dominant system. I mean, at the end of the day, whether you're talking about a patriarchy, a matriarchy, a gynocracy, it has to be backed by law, by policy. And the implication there with policy is that you actually have the power of either police or military force. And of course, the threat of incarceration. That's the only way you have a system that works. So when have Black men had a patriarchy enforced by policy, backed by military or police arm, and of course undergirded by incarceration in regard to anyone that violates patriarchy? When have Black men had that? When? Even when white men had what we would call a patriarchy in a traditional sense, are you suggesting, and feminists do, by the way, that Black men somehow vicariously benefited from this patriarchy? When? White men would throw black men in jail at the merest implication if they had a reason to. This is why there's a long legacy of black men not calling the police when things go down in the black community, even with your woman, because he may show up and take you to jail. And if you had a intimate partner violence situation going on, like Bow Wow in a video I had on my Facebook page a few weeks ago, where his face is bruised up. I think it was from a case from a couple years ago, but he's on video. He's talking to the police. His face has bruises. He's bleeding. The woman has none. The police pulled him to the side and said, "What did you do to her?" And he actually said it. He said, "What do you mean? Look at my face and look at hers. What do you mean, what did I do to her? I didn't do anything to her." It's not because, she's strong and independent and she'll kick him through a wall. Not because of her power. It's because we understand that when it comes to women, especially since the 1960s, because of the lobbying white feminists did and the policy creating they did, and this impacts the white community, so we know it doubly impacts the black community. If black men respond physically the way many black women do, they will go to jail. And we know this because they go to jail when they're the victims. And I pointed that out repeatedly on my channel over the years. So that said, I just wanted to respond to this because, again, whether it's Roland Martin, and he did a similar video not long ago. I don't remember if Boyce Watkins did, but I do remember Roland did, and now Marc Lamont Hill, where you have the black left finding ways to castigate black men for even questioning, regardless of how small or large the number is, for even questioning the practice of blindly voting for Democrats, especially with the rationale that we have to do so by putting in the forefront black women and girls. And at no point has the left or the black left even entertained the question of black male political interests. You know what they consider black male political interests? Being publicly critical of hyper-incarceration, right? So if they can pay lip service to black men, not having to go to prison, that somehow constitutes black male political interest and activism. If they talk about police brutality and how unfair it is, that's enough of that black male shit, as one feminist told me. That's enough of that black male shit. That covers all of it. In other words, what that means is there really isn't a discussion to be had about, granular political interests for black males. There's no discussion to be had because we've already talked about incarceration. And this is the point I was making at my presentation on homelessness. I was trying to say to them that, the issues that black males face to a greater extent than other demographics within the black community further impacts them on a micro granular level in so many different contexts. That we need to learn how to have a distinct discussion about how black males fare in society because we don't know how to. Whether we're talking about carceral treatment, criminal and civil sentencing, leading causes of death, health overall, employment, income, wealth, acquisition, education, violence, intimate partner violence and homicide, rape, housing and homelessness, types of labor, political ideologies and party mobilization, family court impact, and that's a huge one, especially in regard to divorce and child custody, child support, alimony, fatherhood, and access to the resources for black men to be fathers, various forms of protest and marriage. All of these different issues hit different for black men. And it's disingenuous to argue otherwise and then suggest that these black men are the problem when they get tired of the same method of voting for Democrats who ignore how all these issues impact black men. Because you have black men that are starting to question why I'm giving my vote to a party that ignores how all these issues affect black male life. But you have more to say about the percentage that voted for Trump than you have to say about why black men are becoming disenchanted with the Democratic Party. And considering that Marc Lamont Hill is already disenchanted with the party, I may not expect him to agree with all of the various methods black men have started to employ outside of voting for Democrats, but I will say it's a bit disingenuous of him to not take it more seriously and give more black men the benefit of the doubt and holding a discussion about why their voting patterns are changing. But denigrating them, you're more likely to get applause, a pat on the head, and, views. That tends to work. So anyway, this is kind of what I wanted to talk about. I appreciate you here. Hope you guys are well. Holla back at you soon. Peace.